Hello, everybody. How are you?
Hi, Patrice.
Hi there.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much for joining this session. We appreciate all those that are joining. I would like to first introduce both of these great researchers. Dr. Krause is an instructor of the Department of Urban Global Public Health at Rutgers University. She will be presenting her research discussing the role of firearms in occurrence of interpersonal violence among gay, bisexual, and other sexual minority men and transgender women. Her colleague, Chris Stout, who is amazing, will take part and help with getting the word out on this great research. It's on to you guys.
Awesome. Are we good to start now? A little early?
Yeah, you're good to go.
Okay. Can you see the screen?
I can.
Awesome. So I'm gonna just introduce myself real quick, and Chris and I are actually gonna popcorn this back and forth to each other. But as Patrice mentioned, I'm Kristen Kraus, and also the Deputy Director for the Center for Health, Identity, Behavior, and Prevention Studies here at the Rutgers School of Public Health. And I'm really, really excited to be working on this project with not just a colleague, but one of my very, very, very good friends. Both of us were in separate doctoral programs together, myself in public health and Dr. Stoltz in applied psychology, counseling psychology. And so for us to be able to do this together is just kind of like a really big full circle moment for us. So I'll let Chris introduce himself as well.
Yeah, I echo those sentiments, Kristen. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Stultz. I'm an assistant professor of psychology at Baruch College, and I'm also a professor in the health psychology and clinical science program at CUNY. And I'm also the director of my lab, the Sexual and Gender Minority Health Lab.
Awesome. So we've edited this a little bit with all good research projects. We've realized that our original reach might have been a little too broad or too specific. So we've actually broadened our project to include all folks who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, anything under the LGBTQ slash also known as sexual and gender minority umbrella. So we will not just be focusing on gay, bisexual men and trans women, but a little bit more broad of a focus today. And so what we really wanted to do is just kind of describe our current state of the research and what we know to be true on the relationship between interpersonal violence and firearms within sexual and gender minority communities. And with that, kind of outline our current research initiatives to bridge these gaps and kind of discuss where we see the potential impact and the future directions given the current state of our work, which we will get to shortly. But the thing that I just wanted to kind of do first is just kind of contextualize and situate the research center that I mentioned, where both Chris and I did our doctoral training and now have the absolute pleasure of still being involved with as faculty affiliates and myself as the deputy director, which is also known colloquially as CHIPS. And so our mission really is to advance research and knowledge to improve lives of those affected by HIV. But over time, this has definitely been expanded out into other infectious diseases, but also looking at substance use, mental health burdens. And within that, a lot of Dr. Stoltz's work, which we'll talk about shortly, has been situated within intimate and interpersonal violence and kind of how it relates to the overall biopsychosocial health and well-being of people within the LGBT community. And so through this, we do a lot of community engaged work. We are very strong believers in not just doing work for the communities in which we belong to ourselves and study, but also with the communities and populations that we work with. And so we have a lot of different collaborative organizations, some of which you'll probably recognize as being very prominent New Jersey focus groups. The Hyacinth AIDS Foundation, the African American Office of Gay Concerns located in Newark, the North Jersey Community Research Initiative, among others in New York City as well. So CHIPS used to be housed in New York City up until about 2017 when we moved it over here to be housed at Rutgers. And so we've over time really been working hard to establish a relationship not only with the community-based organizations, but also some really great relationships that we have with government agencies at the New Jersey Department of Health, the Newark Department of Health. And so all of this is to say that we really strive to make sure that the findings from all of the work that we do are highly translational, and that they're not just, I think the theme of the day that Dr. Anestis had mentioned earlier is making sure that folks within communities have access to this information, that it's not just sitting in fancy, very expensive journals that we have to publish in order to make this thing go round, but to also engage with community partners in different ways, having, various events, doing webinars, doing things at, local libraries, going to schools, and really making sure that a lot of the work that we are doing is getting out to the folks who could benefit from it the most. So I'm going to pass it back to Dr. Stoltz, who's going to give a little bit of the background on kind of why we're here today.
Sure. So thanks, Kristen. Just to give everyone a little bit of background on the previous research in this area. So one of the things that I think we know that is most relevant is that sexual and gender minority people, which includes lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer populations. Going forward, I'm going to use the acronym SGM to refer to this larger group of people, are much more likely to experience intimate and interpersonal violence as compared to heterosexual and cisgender peers. I'm going to scan a little bit some of the research that we've done in the past. So one of the things that we found previously was that intimate partner violence, so violence in the context of a romantic or sexual relationship, is highly prevalent among young sexual minority men. So in some of the research that we did, that we found that it ranged from anywhere from 39 to 53% in terms of victimization of intimate partner violence. And we found that the rates of perpetration, so committing acts of violence with an intimate partner, range from 12 to 30%. So pretty high rates of this experience among sexual minority men. And then in research looking at younger sexual minority men, we found that just the last 6-month prevalence rates of intimate partner violence range from 9 to 13% for victimization, and 7 to 11% referring to perpetration. And again, this was looking at a younger sample of sexual minority men, but still these high last 6 months prevalence rates that are quite concerning. Some additional background I think worth mentioning is that, so relevant to the state of New Jersey, some previous research has found that at least 16% of bias incidents targeted SGM people in the year 2021. So that's a pretty high preponderance of those incidents. And nearly 1 in 5 hate crimes were motivated by some bias against SGM communities. And 60% of those hate crimes targeted SGM people specifically. Sexual minority men specifically. So a large number of these hate crimes that are being reported, and we know that these are probably underreported, but those that are reported are targeting sexual and gender minority communities at some pretty alarming rates. And sort of circling back to the point I was making just a moment ago, is that most of the state and federal systems do not collect data on sexual orientation and gender identity. So we believe that a lot of these prevalence rates that we're reporting to you are likely underestimating the actual magnitude of the problem. Some other research by the Williams Institute found that with respect to guns in the picture of interpersonal violence, they found that lesbian, gay, and bisexual people were much more likely to report much less likely to report having a gun in the home than heterosexual people. And there's probably some, things that might explain that we can get into later. But that research also found that lesbian, gay, and bisexual respondents were more likely to favor laws that would require people needing to get a permit before purchasing a firearm as compared to heterosexual people. So some interesting findings related to sort of gun involvement as it may pertain to interpersonal violence. So to give you a sense of some of our other work in this area, so as Kristen mentioned earlier, a lot of our work has had to do with intimate partner violence. We've also done some work related to gun violence in SGM communities. I think the most notable of that was a paper that we published in 2017, I believe it was, about the Pulse nightclub shooting that took place in Orlando. A lot of you may remember that at the time it was the most deadly mass shooting in America. Of course, it's no longer considered that now. But in this particular research, we found that we were interested in looking at sort of like the reactions, sort of like post-traumatic reactions that people were having whether or not they were present in Orlando or at the nightclub, or even knew somebody at the nightclub. And we found that, generally speaking, those that had less social privilege among LGBTQ people, so let's say cisgender men, would experience less sort of post-traumatic stress following this experience, following the Pulse nightclub shooting, whereas people that might be considered to have less social privilege, so trans folks, genderqueer folks, other folks that may not have an identity that is associated with privilege in the LGBTQ community, were more likely to experience concerns regarding their safety following the Pulse nightclub shooting. So this is sort of like the beginning, I think, of our program of research related to gun-involved violence in SGM communities that certainly informs this current work that we're undertaking. Okay, so just a few gaps in the literature that I think that are worth noting. The first, as I kind of hinted at earlier, is that there's very little data on gun-related interpersonal violence in SGM populations. As I said before, we suspect that it's highly underreported. Given that it's not tracked appropriately at state and federal levels, we believe that the magnitude of the problem is likely underestimated. As a result of that, we as researchers and therefore policymakers, that might be basing their decisions on our research, are really hindered in their ability to determine the effectiveness of various policies that might be related to firearms, and particularly among SGM populations.
So this kind of leads us to where we are today. And when the Gun Violence Research Center at Rutgers did a call for funding last year, this was something that Dr. Stoltz and I, along with our colleague, Dean Perry Halkitis here at the School of Public Health, kind of wanted to think very diligently about, because we had kind of started this program of research within the aftermath of the Pulse nightclub shooting. Dr. Stoltz's expertise is in intimate partner violence within SGM communities. And so it seemed like a really big missed opportunity when we actually started to dig into the literature and realized, as Chris just mentioned, the significant gaps. And I think the other thing to highlight too, that we didn't really put on the slides, but another theme that has come up throughout today, is that we know that these gaps are vast within the LGBT community as a whole, but it's also important to consider that the LGBT community is not a monolith either. And so within SGM folks, within these groups that we're talking about, there are even more disparities when it comes to socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, educational attainment. And so it's really, really important to try to dig into that a little bit more. And so we decided to kind of propose this mixed method study that we could really start to dive into this a little bit more, because quite frankly, the world's kind of our oyster here. There's just not a lot that's been done. And so we proposed this study to first do a qualitative one-on-one interviews with myself and Chris and a couple of our other team members, to really just get into the nitty-gritty of what are the experiences of gun-related intimate and interpersonal violence among a small sample, where our target is 30, of sexual and gender minority folks living in New Jersey, and then take those findings and really kind of put together a broader quantitative survey. So a survey that we can just kind of put out into the world to folks online, to get a better understanding of some of the things that we find and try to contextualize them a little bit more within the broader scope of the literature, and just to kind of give us a better picture. And so a couple of things that we're really hoping to do. Our first aim is to just describe the overall intersection of gun access, possession, and violence within interpersonal violence among SGM folks in New Jersey. As I mentioned, we'll use these semi-structured interviews. We really do want to ensure that we have a racially diverse sample, sample that's also diverse with regard to gender expression and gender identity. And so one of our hypotheses is that participants will likely report personal experiences with gun access, possession, and/or violence in the context of personal violence, and or know other folks who identify as a sexual and gender minority who have these experiences. And our second aim is really to kind of assess the extent to which gun access, possession, and or violence is explained by some of the various socio-demographic factors that I mentioned before: race, ethnicity, educational attainment, as well as a history of intimate/interpersonal violence, victimization, and/or perpetration among sexual and gender minority folks. So we have a couple hypotheses here is that, again, similar to what we've been talking about today, that we will likely see some of those folks who do not have as much agency and or privilege just based on race, ethnicity, educational attainment, socioeconomic status within the SGM community will likely face higher rates of violence and or perpetration within the context of firearm use. And that we will see associations between gun access, possession, and violence within associated history of interpersonal violence. And we also just kind of want to understand contextually, and we're kind of getting to this within the interviews, is to understand how mental health, substance use, and psychosocial factors, including loneliness, attachment, relationships, all of these other things that often get ignored or at least underplayed when we talk about gun use and gun ownership and all of these things within the SGM community. So again, we're really just kind of hoping to paint a better picture here than what we have right now. And so, as I mentioned, we are currently in the phase, and Chris will talk a little bit later about some of the challenges and opportunities that we've had so far. But we are currently in the midst of phase one, where we are actively recruiting 30 sexual and gender minority adults using referrals from providers. We have thousands of business cards and postcards that have been printed to bring with us to the upcoming Pride events happening throughout the next few months. As well as connecting with various community partners throughout the state to let them know about the study and see if they have any clients and or folks who might be eligible. And so we are hoping to talk with people who are 18 and over, identify as something under the sexual and gender minority umbrella, live in New Jersey, and have reported at least one instance of gun-involved interpersonal violence, meaning that they were either the victim or the perpetrator. And we are assessing this both from an interpersonal, so things that could just happen randomly on the street or in the context of a community situation, or intimate partner, meaning of a close relationship, often contextualized as a romantic or sexual partner. So we are using an online screening questionnaire to determine eligibility. And then if a participant is eligible, they are being contacted by a fantastic member of our study team to schedule the actual appointment. And so, as we've mentioned before, we do have some minimum quotas set for race, ethnicity, especially to ensure that there is a diverse sample, meaning that we don't want to talk with 30 white people at the end of the day. And so at this point, we will be meeting with participants via Zoom to complete the informed consent process and talk about the overall enrollment procedures. Like any research study, we will give participants ample opportunity to ask questions through the consent process. And at any time during the semi-structured interview, if participants wish to stop or take a break or withdraw from the study, of course, they are completely able to do that. We will be recording using the Zoom audio feature so that we can transcribe the interviews afterwards. We anticipate the interviews will take about 60, 70, 90 minutes, depending on how much folks have to say. But they will receive a $50 electronic gift card following the interview via email. And so some of the measures that we're using include a semi-structured interview protocol, which really means that we just have a lot of open-ended questions for folks, starting with basic socio-demographic characteristics, how folks self-identify. And then we start to dig in a little bit more into experiences of interpersonal, and intimate partner violence, as well as any other type of violence that folks may have experienced throughout their lives. And then we'll start to tap in a little bit more to history of gun access and possession, how guns and / firearms were involved in any of these past situations of violence. And then, as I mentioned before, starting to get into how mental health has been affected, what the potential interaction between substance use and or any other psychosocial stressors, how all of that may have come into play with these past experiences. And so, we've built this protocol to be fairly in depth, but also it allows room for folks to kind of speak what's on their mind, and we are not bounded by it in any way. So if the interview kind of takes on a life of its own, that's totally fine. Both Dr. Stultz and myself have had many, many years of qualitative interviewing experience. And fortunately for us, Dr. Stultz is a licensed psychologist. So if either of us or our research assistants identify any potential struggles and or anything that might be particularly alarming with any of the participants that we speak with. He is also trained in mental health first aid, so we at least have those protocols built in for anyone who might be experiencing any undue distress while talking about these things. And so then once we actually get all of these interviews completed, we will start building out phase 2 kind of midway through phase 1, just so that we can start that process. But once we have all of our data, we will use a process called Consensual Qualitative Research Method, which is shorthand CQR, where we really just kind of develop a preliminary set of findings and codes based on the content from the interview protocol itself. Individually, we will review a batch of transcripts and kind of propose additional things that might have come up, some things that we might not have honestly been even thinking about in that process. And then as the code book is finalized, the goal is to come to a consensus with the 2 to 3 people who will be independently reviewing and meeting to assign and address any discrepancies that might come up throughout the overall coding process. So this is just a version of one of our recruitment materials. So we will be able to post the link in the chat afterwards, but I'm going to pass this back to Dr. Stultz to talk about the second phase of the study.
Excellent. So as we were saying just a moment ago, a big purpose of the first phase of the study is to sort of give us some information about how guns are involved in the context of interpersonal violence, in part because when we get to the second phase of the study, which is a quantitative survey, to some extent, we don't know exactly what we need to ask about because we don't really know that much in terms of how guns are sort of involved in experiences of interpersonal violence, at least specifically to SGM populations. So in phase 2 of the study, once we have the information from phase 1, we're going to develop a quantitative survey, and we're going to be administering that survey to a new sample of 250 SGM adults living in New Jersey. We will, as we did before, work with our community partners to recruit this sample. We'll use active and passive methods. The eligibility criteria will be similar to phase 1 in that people have to be age 18 or older, identify as SGM, live in New Jersey, and report at least one instance of interpersonal violence, but it doesn't have to be gun-specific interpersonal violence. And the reason for that is we want to get a sense of those experiencing interpersonal violence, what percentage experience some form of it that involves a gun. So unlike the first phase where the experiences that we're looking for are gun specific, and we'll use an online screening to determine eligibility. So what we'll do is first we'll get informed consent. This will be a much shorter survey as compared to the phase 1 survey. It should take hopefully around 20 minutes to complete. Participants will receive a $10 gift card via email after they've completed it. We'll use our sort of usual security methods for maintaining the data, and we will put in safeguards to make sure that that these are true respondents, so these are actual respondents and not bots or other folks that aren't otherwise eligible. All right, as far as the measures, I won't belabor this too much so that we have time for Q&A, but we'll have measures on the survey related to socio-demographic characteristics. So for example, race and ethnicity. We'll have measures related to experiences of interpersonal violence, both ones that are specific to intimate partners as well as those that are related to other types of relationships. We'll use measures related to gun access, possession, and violence victimization and perpetration. We'll have measures related to mental health, substance use, and psychosocial factors. So, for example, we'll have a measure of depression, a measure of PTSD, of alcohol use, and so on. And then finally, we're going to have new items that will come from the data that we collect in phase one. So those are the items, those are the questions that we don't know exactly what they'll be because we have not completed all of the interviews for phase one. And so that will, I think, in some ways be the most exciting part of the quantitative survey because it will be the part that is informed by these rich interviews that we're doing with participants currently. Similarly, I won't belabor these points too much, but as far as the analytic plan is concerned, we'll first look at some of the descriptive variables of interest. We'll look at some of the bivariable associations, particularly the ones that have to do with some of the mental health, psychosocial, socio-demographic factors in relation to the gun-related IPV variables. And then finally, we will use multivariable analyses to do more sophisticated modeling related to all of the variables of interest. And similarly, like I was saying before, some of these hypotheses we will develop based on the information that we get from the data in phase one. And just to give you a sense of the timeline and sort of where we've been and where we're at, it took us quite a bit to get the IRB approved. And I'll give away the game a little bit in that. So one of the cool things is that Dr. Krause and I are doing this research together, but we're at two different institutions. I'm at CUNY, she's at Rutgers. And so in addition to sort of just shepherding the IRB, the protocol through the IRB at Rutgers, we also had to get the two IRBs to play nicely together, which has taken a little longer than I think we expected. But the good news is that I think we're laying down a foundation that will hopefully serve us well in the future to continue collaborating across institutions and building those relationships across the two IRBs. So we are currently in the process of collecting the data for phase one. So we're scheduling and completing those qualitative interviews currently. We're hoping to wrap those up by summertime, somewhere in July, August, to do some preliminary analyses of the qualitative data. As we mentioned, once we've got some of that qualitative data in, we can start to really fill out the final sections of that quantitative survey. A lot of it, we already know what we want to ask, but there's a good chunk of it that we won't know what we're going to really ask about until we get the data from phase one in and completed. We're aiming to start collecting the data for the quantitative survey in October, aiming to wrap that up in December, and then next year really getting into the analysis of the data as well as preparing manuscripts from this data and hopefully submitting grants in the future to extend this research further. All right, so on to challenges and opportunities. Maybe I can cover the challenges a little bit and then I'll pass it back to you. So as I mentioned, we had a little bit of a delay with the IRB approval, particularly because we're trying to work across two institutions, as well as the sensitivity of the information we're collecting. As you might imagine, when you're talking to research participants about gun violence, that can make the hairs on the back of the IRB's necks stand up a little bit. And so we had to make sure that all of the appropriate safety protocols were in place. And then also the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has not made things easier. So for the moment, we're having to do a lot of our study activities virtually, and depending on sort of the way the pandemic unfolds in the future, we may be able to transition to more in-person activities. But for the moment, that has been a challenge as well.
Yeah. And fortunately, a couple days ago, we got our final IRB approvals, I think. So we're moving forward on that for sure. And, you know, I think with that, it's just definitely been a learning opportunity for us both. I think now for any future study we do together, we know exactly what forms need to be filled out and who needs to sign and where they need to be uploaded. So, you know, there's definitely things that we've learned along the way. And even though, you know, Chris and I think we met 8 years ago taking a class together. So we've got the friendship part down, but the NIH doesn't really care that you guys can have like a fun night out on the town. They want to actually know that you can actually work together in a professional setting. And this has allowed us to actually build the foundation for that moving forward. So I think for both of us, like I said before, we're just really excited to be able to do this together and to be able to kind of bring both of our strengths to this project and keep things moving forward. And, you know, we're really just grateful for the GVRC to have this opportunity because so much of the NIH level, CDC level funding requires preliminary data. It's just how the structure is set up. So us being able to have this data in a it really just kind of sets the foundation for any future innovation, which is such a huge part of scoring any type of grant submission. And to be able to say this really hasn't been done at all and actually mean it, I think for us is just a great thing for us to be able to do. And, you know, in terms of potential impact and future directions, I think understanding what this all looks like in New Jersey specifically, you know, we've talked a lot at CHIPS and just in general on how oftentimes New Jersey sometimes gets left in the shadow of New York and Pennsylvania sometimes. So being able to have this be a New Jersey specific study is something that's really, you know, been important to us. And just to be able to examine this in any situation. And, you know, as we've already said, trying to translate these findings into future proposals. Like I said, Dr. Stoltz is the expert in our team on intimate partner violence. So this is a way for me to be able to strengthen that muscle a little bit more. And yeah, anything else on that, Chris?
I don't think so.
Well, I have a question.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So the first question, little if any messaging on safe firearm storage is geared specifically towards individuals who endorse sexual minority identities. Are there specific ways you think we can effectively promote behaviors like safe fire storage among firearm owners in these communities?
I can take a stab at this. I don't know if there's any messaging that's specific to SGM communities. You know, there is some research, as I mentioned at the beginning, that SGM folks appear less likely to own firearms. But I don't imagine that there has been much advertisement or messaging related to safe firearm storage specific to this community. But it's certainly worth looking further into, particularly as it relates to the participants that we might be speaking to that do own firearms and aren't just talking about instances where they were a victim of firearm violence. To learn more about, like, if you were to be the recipient of some sort of message, what would you want to hear? What would be something that would be, you know, appealing to you?
I think there's also quite frankly, before we even dove into this literature, I think there's a stereotype that a lot of LGBT people are against guns, which is true. But I do think then that it leaves a portion of the population who do own guns and who do use them for whether it's work or personal, recreational. And so I do think that that's a group, just when we think politically and structurally, that just often gets ignored or is just maybe assumed to not be part of the gun ownership, gun use community. And so I do think that there's missed opportunities there for that.
Yeah. Another question, so we can close with that, is firearm ownership is often associated with majority groups, not routinely subject to discrimination and protection. Is typically the most common reason such individuals own firearms. But within a sexual minority community, discrimination and physical threats are more of a day-to-day reality. Do you think protective firearm ownership within these communities is a response to these actual threats, or do you think it is more similar to the defensive firearm ownership we see among individuals such like encounter these experiences? A lot. That's a tongue twister, right?
I don't know. My initial gut reaction says it could go either way just because we don't know. And I hate that's always our default answer, but it really, there's just so little known. And the Williams Institute report that Chris highlighted earlier is really kind of the, like, if you search in Google Scholar or PubMed or anything like gun violence, LGBT, that's usually the first thing that comes up.
Mhm.
There's been some other things that have been published in response to the Pulse nightclub shooting, which we were part of as well. But yeah, it's hard to say whether or not it is like a...
These portraits are indeed inspired by loss. There is indeed an intense desire.
That's weird. So I, you know, in my opinion, it's just hard to say whether it is a defense, it's like a mode of protection. I do think that there's probably differences within the LGBT community, which is why I wanted to highlight that, you know, often we get lumped together, but we're not a monolith. Like, you know, Chris and I have talked anecdotally. I've seen it in a lot of like lesbian, queer women groups that, you know, there's a decent number of women who own guns and like to just go to the shooting range or hunt, whatever people use guns for. So that's my gut answer. I don't know, Chris, you have anything else on that?
Yeah, I would say the same, that there's a lot that we don't know. And I would say that within certain, I think, subgroups of the LGBT community, like you mentioned, it might be more normative to own a gun as either for protection or for recreation. But I think there's probably other subgroups where owning a gun is actually seen as kind of like a social faux pas, like you wouldn't want to admit it at a party. And so I think we're going to get really interesting data regarding gun ownership from the qualitative study to learn sort of what groups are more or less likely to own one.
Well, thank you so much to the both of you. I appreciate it. If you guys are still interested, you can definitely join us in session number 2. All you have to do is just click on the sessions button that's literally right to the side of Christopher or the side of Christine, however you're sitting. But we appreciate everybody. We appreciate Christopher and Christine doing this, and we look forward to another GVRC Research Day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.